good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this Holicare webinar. This is webinar number 7 in the series. So if you're joining us for the first time, you have missed a couple. Good news that they are recorded and you can look back and see what we've been discussing before. Holicare, Holistic Diagnostics, is a project that is run by a consortium of 14 African and European partners, and it works towards developing innovative diagnostics for lower respiratory tract infections, such as COVID, tuberculosis, and others. And you can see the consortium members that are involved in this project. Today, we're here at Stockholm University at SPIDER, and we are joined by a team of experts that are going to be discussing the issue of gender, ethics, and contextual considerations in international clinical trials. As you see, it's a huge consortium and from different countries and contexts. There might be a few things that are different in terms of how research is conducted, and that's what we are here to discuss. My name is John Black Kabuche. I am a medical doctor and I am a health informatics expert, currently working as a health systems research manager at SPIDER. And throughout the discussion, I'll be introducing the other speakers that we're having today. So, as I mentioned, Holicare is working towards innovative diagnostics, and these include, for example, lateral flow assays, as well as LAMP for DNA amplification, and microfluidics innovations, for example, that can help us to have lab on chip. And these are important because they enable us to have point-of-care diagnostics that can be used even in places where you don't have enough infrastructure. And these innovations are now being tested in clinical trials in Senegal, in Uganda, and Ethiopia. And we're going to be reflecting not only on those technical details, but we're going to be reflecting also on the interpersonal things that come up as you do these kind of studies. And that is the webinar for today. We'll not go into the details, but you can check the Holicare website to learn more about the consortium and the innovations that we're working on, the partners, as well as seeing the previous webinars. So now we will start with the first session of this webinar with a presentation from Josie Mensah-Kane, who is a data science manager at GaDx. And Josie has a background in biochemistry. Over the past years, she has been working in data science initiatives across various projects, specializing in application of machine learning to create predictive algorithms for diseases such as sepsis, pancreatic cancer, UTIs, and more. And Josie has been involved in initiating the clinical trial for Holicare in Senegal, and she's going to be sharing her experiences from there.
So thank you again, John Black, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. So just a bit of background about me. So as John Black mentioned, I'm the data science manager at Global Access Diagnostics, and my background is in biochemistry and bioinformatics. So I specialize in the development of predictive algorithms for diseases such as sepsis, pancreatic cancer, UTIs, and more. And my expertise also lies in statistical planning for clinical trials. So from sample size calculations to data analysis. And currently, I'm collaborating with our clinical trials manager, Devanshi, on the setup of the Holicare clinical trial across Senegal, Ethiopia, and Uganda. So here's just a summary of what I'll be presenting today. So I'll start by giving you a brief background on the Holicare clinical trial. So just the aims and objectives, just enough information to give us the context that we need for the presentation. And then we'll walk through some of the key challenges that we both anticipated and faced as we set up this multi-country study. And next, I'll share the solutions that we put in place to address these challenges across the different healthcare settings. And then I'll go on to the impact. So, how these solutions actually helped us maintain the integrity of the study and also ensure patient safety and keep the trial on track. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A where I'm happy to dive deeper into any part of the process or discussions on the lessons learned. So a bit of background on the Holicare clinical trial. So it's a clinical study that's being set up across three sub-Saharan African countries. So that's Senegal, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And the aim is to evaluate two innovative diagnostic tests for both upper and lower respiratory tract infections. So, respiratory tract infections are actually a leading cause of mortality in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so, conducting the trial here just helps us gather that real-world data in the settings where the diagnostics are actually needed the most. So, there are two sub-studies that will be happening simultaneously. We have sub-study 1, which is evaluating a lateral flow test, and it's designed to detect three upper respiratory tract infections. So, we have flu, COVID, and RSV. It's a very quick test and very easy to interpret. So the patient comes in, they give their consent. We'll take a nasopharyngeal swab from them, and then the result can be ready within 20 minutes. It also comes paired with an app that can be used on an Android tablet just to help interpret the results. And then we have sub-study 2, which is evaluating a point of care test. So this actually aims to detect up to 12 different pathogens that can cause lower respiratory tract infections. So for example, tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and more. And it actually does this through a process called microfluidic lamp isothermal amplification. And so the general overview of the study is that when a patient comes in, they give their consent if they want to, and the clinician decides whether they think they have an upper respiratory tract infection, so either flu, COVID, or RSV, or if they think they have a lower respiratory tract infection, so like pneumonia or bronchitis or tuberculosis. And then they will test them according to, whichever disease they think they have. So either on the lateral flow test or the point of care instrument. And just to give you an idea of how large this clinical trial actually is, we're aiming to recruit around just over 2,000 patients in total across the whole study. So in Senegal, we have 3 sites. In Uganda, we have 3 sites. And in Ethiopia, we have 6 sites. So for sub-study 1, so that's the study using the lateral flow test and targeting those upper respiratory tract infections. We're aiming to recruit around 960 patients. And then for sub-study 2, so that's the LAMP assay that's looking at those 12 pathogens for lower respiratory tract infections. We're aiming to recruit around 1,200 patients. And so just to give you an idea of the timelines of the study, so the setup of the study is near complete, and we're hoping to recruit our first patient within the coming days. And so now that I've given the background to the Holicare clinical trials and the countries that will be taking part in this trial, I'll now go on to discuss the main challenges that we faced and anticipated during the setup of the trial and how we combated them. So first, we have breaking down barriers to patient knowledge and informed consent. So one of the main challenges we anticipated, especially for the patients, was the potential for communication barriers, just due to all the diverse languages and dialects across the countries involved in the trial. And we wanted to ensure that each patient fully understood what the trial was about, why they were doing it if they chose to, and what kind of samples we'll be asking from them. And most importantly, empowering their ability to give informed consent to participate. So we not only wanted the patients to understand what the trial was about, but also that they don't have to participate if they choose not to, and that they can withdraw their consent at any point. So to combat this issue, we partnered with the local clinical teams across Senegal, Uganda, and Ethiopia, just to ensure that all the patient-facing documents were translated into local languages and dialects. So by patient-facing documents, I mean those documents that explain what the trial is about and also explain what samples will be taken from the patient. And then also the informed consent sheets that they need to sign to give their consent to participate. So we also ensured that we had tailored forms for children that broke down the information in a more simple way while still giving them the knowledge that they needed. And in children's case, they would still need an adult to give informed consent on their behalf, but we wanted to ensure that children were privy to, what the trial was about. And then finally, we provided flexible options for giving consent. So we allow thumbprints in place of signatures for patients who are unable to sign. And we also allow participants to come in with a trusted friend or family member just to help read and explain the forms if they need. So in the end, this just helps us gather more reliable data and also foster that genuine community engagement and most importantly, protect the rights and the well-being of every patient who takes part in this Holicare clinical trial. And finally, it allows patients to make truly informed decisions before agreeing to participate in the trial, regardless of their age or literacy levels or language barriers. So next we have data collection and app access without internet. So another challenge we anticipated was that some of the local sites, so particularly those in the more rural areas, there might not always be reliable internet access. And as mentioned earlier, the lateral flow test is actually paired with an Android app that can be used on a tablet to help interpret the results. So just to ensure that we address any potential connectivity issues, we made sure that the app could be accessed and used entirely offline without internet. And similarly, with the electronic database that's being used to house the patient information and the results of the test, we ensured that that could also be accessed offline without an internet connection. And in both cases, whenever internet connection did become available, the data is then automatically synced to the cloud and securely stored. So this just ensures that data collection remains uninterrupted and secure, regardless of any local connectivity challenges. And this again helps preserve the quality and completeness of the study data across all sites. And then we have breaking through shipping and customs barriers. So the next challenge we ran into was making sure that all medical devices and sample collection materials needed for the study actually arrived to the right countries on time. So most of these materials were shipped from either the UK or Sweden. And as you can imagine, shipping medical devices internationally comes with a lot of strict custom rules, and each country also has its own restrictions and regulations and paperwork that needs to be followed. So, for example, in Uganda and Ethiopia, all receivers of medical devices need to obtain a pre-import permit from either the National Drug Authority in Uganda or the Ethiopian Food and Drug Administration in Ethiopia before anything can be shipped. So there's a lot of paperwork that's involved in obtaining these permits and ensuring that the devices can get to the relevant countries on time. Because there are cases where medical equipment can be stuck in customs for months, sometimes 3 to 4 months. So to combat those potential issues, we built an extra lead time just to ensure shipment schedules to accommodate the potential custom delays. And we also partnered with experienced logistics providers who were able to understand those local regulations and custom processes. And finally, we prepared all the necessary documentation and permits and regulatory approvals in advance for each country, just to reduce any of these custom delays. And so again, by proactively addressing these challenges, we were able to minimize any disruptions and also keep the trial on track and ensure that all sites received the supplies they needed on time. And then finally, we have adapting biological sample storage for real-world constraints. So another significant challenge we anticipated was related to sample storage. So we're collecting an array of non-invasive samples from patients. So for example, nasopharyngeal swabs, saliva samples, and sputum samples. So while some of these can be tested right away, others actually need to be stored later for analysis. So to preserve the integrity of these biological materials, certain samples need to be stored in extremely low temperatures, so minus 20 degrees and sometimes even down to minus 80 degrees Celsius. But however, not all of the sites have access to these ultra low temperature freezers. And so how we combated this was fortunately, most of the samples actually can be safely stored in refrigerated conditions. So that's around 2 to 8 degrees Celsius for a limited amount of time. So that's usually 48 to 72 hours before they need to be transported to, colder storage, so minus 20 or minus 80 degrees. And to address this, the local clinical teams, they have regular daily transport from sites without low temperature freezers to the central laboratories that are equipped for these ultra cold storage services. So again, by putting these measures in place, we ensure that all sites can participate fully in the clinical trial and maintain high sample, integrity and uphold the scientific integrity of the study, even when the laboratory resources vary. So those are the main challenges we faced. And in conclusion, we learned that proactive planning matters. So anticipating any operational changes or challenges such as language barriers and connectivity issues and custom delays and also infrastructure gaps is definitely essential. We also learned that tailored solutions work. So we learned that customizing strategies to local realities, such as ensuring that we can transport samples from sites that don't have access to low, the freezers that go up to minus 20 and minus 80 degrees, ensuring that transport can happen seamlessly, and also ensuring participant safety. So ensuring that participants knew exactly what the trial was about, why they'll be participating, and also understanding that they can withdraw consent at any time if they want to. We also learned that collaboration is key, definitely. So, in working with, closely with the local teams, we're able to anticipate any issues that may arise. And so, for example, with the shipping of the equipment, the local teams are the ones that know, all the processes that need to happen and all the different paperwork that's needed. So, keeping that communication with them was essential. And also the clinical staff, ensuring that they're aware of how to collect the materials, or the samples that they need, and how to convey certain messages to the participants as well. It just helps us overcome any barriers and adapt as quickly as possible. And finally, looking ahead in terms of lessons learned for future clinical trials in similar settings. So we have learned a lot of lessons, and I feel like there is definitely there's a lot that can happen in terms of these kind of clinical trials, especially ones that include technologies. So, for example, the way we have the Holicare app, and also tailoring it to different internet connectivity issues, etc. And overall, this will just help accelerate access to innovative diagnostics and improve healthcare outcomes, especially in sub-Saharan African countries. And that's everything from me. And thank you for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Thank you, Josie, for an excellent presentation of real life experiences and adaptations. I like the fact that you report, for example, adapting how data is synchronized, working offline. This is, again, we all assume that there is internet everywhere, but the realities might be different in different places. So
Exactly.
again, this should be considered. And having samples and reagents that can be stored at refrigeration as opposed to ultra freezing temperatures again, that means that we can have the services available in places where this infrastructure might not be present. So thank you. I assume everyone else has also picked up some interesting adaptations. Thanks for sharing that. So there are some questions, and a participant asks a question about shipment of medical devices. Are the rules for research use only devices, which is typically the outcome of research projects, as strict as the rules for actual or commercial diagnostic devices?
Yes, so that's one thing we actually discovered, that it's definitely as strict. So as I mentioned, so for example, with Uganda, you still need your pre-import permit from the National Drug Authority, and Uganda, you need your your pre-import permit as well for the Ethiopian Food and Drug Authority. And all our devices are research use only, but we still had to gather up all this information and all the paperwork that was needed, and it did still go through rigorous customs procedures, and the local logistics teams that were used. There was always daily communication just to ensure that everything was streamlined and happened accordingly. So yes, there definitely are very strict measures imposed on just research use products as well.
Thank you. We do have another question. Well, two questions actually. What percentage of sites for clinical trials are in rural areas? And does the testing, that is LFT or point of care lab, happen at the sites? Or the sites only collect samples and testing is done at a central location?
Okay, that's a very good question. So we do have quite a few of the sites in rural areas. So I'll say around let's say even up to 40% of the sites could be in rural areas. And in terms of the testing, so with the lateral flow testing, it's a very simple procedure. So the patient comes in, the research nurse takes the nasopharyngeal swab and they do the testing on site, and the result can be ready in 20 minutes. So there is no storage or anything needed with the lateral flow device. And then with the other test, so with the LAMP assay, the samples actually need to be stored until the LAMP assay is ready to be used. And with that, depending on if it's available at that time, it could be done on site, or it could also be done at the central laboratory where the samples are shipped. So wherever the -20 and -80 freezers are, or where the testing can be done for the more complex assays.
All right, so then thank you, Josie. Just stick around and answer the questions. But we'll go on to the next part of this discussion, and that is going to be a panel where we have different speakers. As you can see them on the screen, we have Matt Molkvist, who is a professor at Uppsala University. And we have, that is in Sweden. We have Mekonen Teferi, who is a researcher at Ahiri in Ethiopia, who has been working in pharmacology and different trials of pharmacovigilance. We have Yap Bom, the second, who has been involved again in different clinical studies of infectious diseases in Africa, including at Africa CDC, as well as previously working at Medicines Sans Frontières, MSF. And then we have Fatoumata Deyassar, who is a medical doctor and public health specialist at IPD Dakar in Senegal, with over 25 years of experience in infectious diseases research. So thank you so much for joining us, the panel participants. We will begin with a video where we recorded Fatoumata's presentation or her responses to different questions that we've been asking her in the panel, because that was presented in French and we needed to give some translation. So I will ask my colleague to share that discussion, and then of course you can ask Fatoumata questions. She's online and will be able to answer, and this can also be asked in French. And then after that, we will have discussion with the rest of the panel members.
Bonjour et merci de m'avoir donné l'opportunité de me présenter. Donc, je m'appelle Fatoumata Diène, donc je suis médecin épidémiologiste. Présentement, je travaille à l'Institut Pasteur où je pilote des projets. Donc, un des projets est le projet Presto, qui a pour objectif de comparer deux outils diagnostiques échographiques. Un outil portatif qui est le nouveau à comparer avec l'outil utilisé en routine dans nos structures de santé. Le deuxième projet, c'est le projet Birdie. Donc, ce projet a pour objectif d'évaluer l'incidence des infections multirésistantes chez les nourrissons, les nouveau-nés et les enfants. C'est également un projet multi-pays, donc avec des sites à Madagascar et au Sénégal. L'autre projet est le projet Promodac. Donc, ce projet porte sur le VIH. Donc là également, l'objectif était d'améliorer la prise en charge des sujets adultes vivant avec le VIH, donc dans des pays en Asie du Sud-Est également et en Afrique. Donc le dernier projet qui a porté sur l'éthique, donc c'est le projet SIRAFES, et l'objectif était de capaciter les personnes évoluant dans la recherche dans 5 pays francophones. Donc actuellement, mon objectif est de partager l'expérience que j'ai acquise à travers le pilotage de ces projets à des équipes beaucoup plus jeunes. Ok. Donc pour la question éthique, donc le projet SIRAFES a été un exemple vraiment concret. Donc pour harmoniser les pratiques, on a fait une enquête pour voir quels étaient les gaps par rapport aux acquis et aux obligations des comités, des personnes qui déposaient auprès des comités d'éthique. Donc on a vu qu'il y avait une très grande différence entre les différents pays. Donc ce qu'on a essayé de faire pour pallier à ça, donc on a proposé la mise en place d'une plateforme de soumission. Donc cette plateforme est commune, donc peut être utilisée par les 5 pays. Par exemple, pour gérer un projet en commun ou bien pour partager les informations en temps réel dans la gestion des épidémies. Donc, pour ce qui est du genre, il faut voir que dans les 5 pays, à travers ce projet SIRAFES, on a constaté qu'il y avait un déséquilibre dans la composition des équipes de recherche et également dans la composition des membres des comités d'éthique. Donc, il y avait plus d'hommes que de femmes. Donc, par rapport à la réalité que nous vivons chaque jour pour la recherche, il faut voir qu'en Afrique, la recherche est d'abord une dimension familiale. Un exemple pour le projet Presto, donc pour inclure une femme enceinte, il fallait que cette femme ait l'autorisation soit du mari, soit de la belle-famille. Oui, donc toujours l'expérience que nous avons acquise avec la gestion du projet SIRAFES. Donc lors de ce projet, donc, on a eu à évaluer les procédures de soumission dans chaque pays. Donc ce qu'on a constaté, par exemple en République centrafricaine, donc la police d'assurance n'était pas requise lors de la soumission. Donc un autre exemple dans 3 pays comme la République démocratique du Congo, la République centrafricaine et la Côte d'Ivoire, là également le contrat de collaboration n'était pas requis. Donc la différence entre les différents processus va ralentir également donc, le travail que les chercheurs doivent mener donc, soit pour mettre en place des études. Donc la récente épidémie d'Ebola nous a montré l'importance du réseautage dans la recherche pour pouvoir partager les informations à temps réel. Je suis pour le remboursement du transport pour plusieurs arguments. D'abord, c'est vrai que le consentement doit être libre et éclairé et donc aucun moyen incitatif ne doit être toléré. Parallèlement, tout frais généré par la participation de la personne à l'étude doit être remboursé. Cependant, le montant ne doit pas être incitatif. Donc au Sénégal, cette rémunération est encadrée par le comité d'éthique qui évalue le montant selon le site et selon le coût de la vie. Le renforcement de capacité doit être une nécessité et doit être au cœur de la collaboration. Donc ce renforcement de capacité passe d'abord par la formation, Donc la prise en charge des honoraires des jeunes chercheurs, les équipements au niveau des labos, etc. Donc cela ne doit pas être vu comme une faveur, mais comme une nécessité, comme je l'ai dit tantôt. Ok, ce déséquilibre, comme vous le dites, va créer des frustrations, donc va démotiver les chercheurs. Donc ce déséquilibre se manifeste soit dans l'attribution des rôles de leadership, dans les décisions politiques ou bien la reconnaissance même de l'individu par rapport au travail qu'il a fourni. Donc les solutions vont sur plusieurs niveaux. Donc au niveau international, donc il faut encourager le financement de projets communs Nord-Sud, donc avec un leadership dans les pays du Sud. Au niveau régional également, encourager le cofinancement des projets. Par exemple, un projet sur le paludisme peut être cofinancé par le Sénégal, la Guinée, la Côte d'Ivoire. Donc au sein des équipes également, on peut donner une solution, c'est-à-dire il faut au début de chaque projet, dans un contrat de collaboration très clair, définir les rôles de chacun et c'est le temps mis pour participer à ce projet qui va définir par exemple l'ordre dans la liste des auteurs. Ok, donc de manière proactive, donc soutenir la recherche va se faire à plusieurs niveaux. Donc au niveau étatique, donc il faut que l'État impose ou bien partage avec les instituts de recherche et les universités donc des financements, met à disposition des financements pour les chercheurs. Les structures académiques ou bien les universités également doivent inclure dans le programme des formations donc sur les métiers de la recherche tels que chef de projet, technicien, moniteur d'études cliniques. Donc au sein de chaque institut de recherche ou bien au niveau de l'université, disposer de programmes donc avec des plans de carrière, donc avec également des contrats de travail sécurisés tels que le CDI, donc disposer également de programmes d'animation scientifique. Donc l'État ou les institutions peuvent mettre à disposition également des jeunes chercheurs des bourses de formation, donc ou bien partager leur expérience avec d'autres équipes locales, régionales ou internationales, ou bien également de mettre à leur disposition des programmes d'immersion, c'est-à-dire les jeunes chercheurs peuvent aller d'un pays à un autre ou bien d'un institut à un autre donc pour partager leurs expériences. Donc au sein des projets de recherche également, soutenir et favoriser donc l'inclusion des jeunes chercheurs en leur garantissant un temps de formation, donc un mentoring donc, pour pouvoir les accompagner dans toutes leurs activités.
Merci. Thank you, Fatoumata, for this overview of the perspectives from Senegal. And I hope that you are able to follow those who are like me, who don't get French. But now we'll move on to the rest of the panel members. And I will also first ask you to just briefly tell us about your experience with regards to international clinical trials, sort of the same kind of questions that Fatoumata discussed. And then I'll go on to the next part. So we start with you, Matt. Can you tell us your experience with international clinical trials?
Thank you so much, John Black. It's very nice to be here. And thank you, Fatoumata, for that very nice film, very extensive. So I'm a professor of global health at Uppsala University. And I'm also part of the Holicare project as an ethical advisor. My research has previously been focusing a lot on implementation studies, different types of interventions for maternal and child health. And for example, we did a rather large-scale hospital-based study in Nepal with the introduction of helping babies breathe algorithm, package there. It was a collaboration with UNICEF in that project. So that's the most clinical trial I've been involved in. Otherwise, it's mostly community-based interventions and research. Thank you.
And can you share a moment in your research collaborations where ethical or gender or really contextual issues arose and took you by surprise? If if you can give us an example you can remember.
Took me by surprise. Well, one thing that has been, but the main thing that I can come to think of in terms of difficulties is actually the relationship between the Swedish ethical authority and the local. In this case, then, if we take the case of Nepal, because in a Swedish context, the Swedish ethical councils or boards, they are not very well versed in global health issues and how global collaboration in trials and research is happening, because we have a centralized ethics review authority. So many times when applying for research or for ethical approval in Sweden, you get answers that are not maybe sufficient or that are reflecting an uncertainty among the committee members on whether they should or should not approve the study, for example. There has been on and off for many years. For one period, it was a lot about that all projects in a third country, so to say, or in a different country should be approved also in Sweden. And then for a while they said that no, it's only the local permits that are needed. And then they changed again to say that, yeah, it's the local permits that should be required, but then you should also need a supplementary approval in Sweden in case you are going to work with this. So it's been a lot of on and off, and I think that is a lack of capacity in the Swedish system that has caused the most problem for me. It kind of took me by surprise when one of my PhD students was going to defend, and then we have heard that permits in Sweden was not necessary, only the permits in the country of where the research project was going on, and almost ended up in her not being able to defend her 4-year work, and that would have been disastrous, of course. But we managed to solve that eventually. So I would say that's my most, I don't know if it's surprising, but it's frustrating, I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Mats, for sharing. Mekonnen, are you able to also briefly introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your encounters with ethical and gender issues?
All right, thank you very much. And I'm happy that I'm joining you and share more insights. Yeah, my name is Mekonnen from Ethiopia, Harmo Hansich Research Institute. I'm a clinical researcher and have been experiencing a few clinical trials and bioequivalence studies over the last 15 years. And currently, actually, I'm leading the clinical trial unit at AHARI. So I had opportunities to be part of the international clinical trials, such as the STREAM for treatment of MDR-TB patients and the WHO Solidarity trial for treatment of COVID-19. So I may possibly share some insights from this experience in terms of gender ethics and practical context. May I proceed?
Yes, please.
All right, thank you. So my perspective is a bit different. I'm just looking at the gender and ethics as well as the practical context realities from the perspective of access to clinical trials in general. As you know, as we are talking about international clinical trials, it's about, first of all, accessing how many of the countries, particularly in LMICs, have access to international clinical trial. That's very much limited, which is actually as a case for the global health disparities. So the bottom line, the background by itself is the healthcare in general and access to treatment is somehow disparity, particularly in low and middle income countries. So as long as we don't have enough access to take part in clinical trials, we cannot actually fully address the gender ethics and the contextual realities. From this perspective, I think it's good just to mention about the WHO Solidarity trial for COVID-19 treatment platform as one of the example that tried to provide access to many of the countries, many of the settings for that matter, at different levels So it was one of the largest randomized clinical trial during the COVID pandemic, which enrolled like more than 400 hospitals over 30 countries that actually address inequalities, I can say, because it helps just to have access to treatment in one hand, on the other hand, representation in terms of generating diverse data.
We seem to have connectivity issues, again, demonstrating the same practical realities we're talking about. But I think we'll be able to get Meknon back. But for now, I can ask Yap, if you could just briefly introduce yourself as well and your experiences, and especially issues related to ethics and gender.
I also have a very poor connection, but I'm working on it. So once it's on, I will be able to open the camera. But just confirm that you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I've been working for the last 20 years in preclinical and clinical trial. First with MSF, Dr. Without Borders in Epicent in Uganda, which is one of the sites of the Holicare project, doing clinical trial on TB, malaria, HIV, and many other diseases. And then from there, I moved to the Pasteur Institute of Bangui, South African Republic, where also we were doing clinical trial on Mpox, trying to find the efficacy of new drugs. At the time, it was the tecofirimat. And currently, I'm leading the Mpox response for the Africa CDC, where, again, we are looking for new options in terms of drugs, in terms of rapid tests, but also in terms of vaccine. So maybe the point I will make, I think that the two panelists that came before me highlight well the issue of gender and ethics. I will go more on how ethical it is for us to ensure that the benefit of the research are also for the communities that have been involved in that research. Few years ago, there has been a clinical trial on the evaluation of rapid diagnostic tests against Lassa fever that happened in Nigeria. So the results were outstanding. So they got a very good rapid test that was evaluated, good performance, and then the manufacturer used those results to have the pre-qualification by WHO and all the different organisms. So now it went into production, into sales. So now, less than a year even after that, there was a big outbreak of Lassa fever in Nigeria. And the center that has been part of the research was requesting to the manufacturer whether they could have some rapid tests made available to them so that they can actually use them in the response to that outbreak. And the answer was just no. It was not possible because now they moved from the research to the sales. And for the sales, someone has to pay for it. So this is one of the most challenge for us as ethics is concerned, is now we are working in Holicare, assessing new diagnostic, and we are ensuring that once those tests will be outstanding, we have to make sure that the different sites, the different countries that have contributed should have access to those tests. Which mechanism, it will have to be found, but I think for me, that is one of the most critical ethical challenges on the clinical research that we are doing. How the beneficiary, after the trial, will again benefit from the result of the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, issues that I think all of us relate to, starting from the differences in ethical approval, as Matt was explaining, especially if you're running studies across countries and one country asks for this and the other one asks for the other. Meknon is back now. He was talking about the issue of access if you don't have studies and why we need to have solidarity and making sure that the studies are done in all different countries. And also what Yap has just talked about, how do we benefit the local communities where the studies are being done, not just focusing on research, but leaving actual impact. So I would like to go on to the next question, and this time I'm going to start with Meknon since you left before. And in this case, I want to talk about power dynamics. I'm conscious of the time, But I want to discuss the issue of power dynamics when you have people from different countries, from different contexts, and maybe even different academic journey durations. Can you comment about this and how you have experienced it? Because I think this is actually within our power to address. It's not the big pharmaceutical company or manufacturer, but this is really how we relate with each other. So can you comment on your experience on this with regards to the studies that you've been involved in? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, you are right. So I think the power dynamics and imbalance could be expressed in different ways in the relationship between different stakeholders in international clinical trials. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, whenever we are talking about international clinical trials, we are talking about multiple actors from different perspective or from different background. So that could be like reflected in terms of hierarchical, like sponsors somehow could have influences over some of the trial management design and so on, as they have better information and so on. The economics and the resource disparity at the background we have, and the knowledge and information asymmetry also that can contribute to the power imbalance in general. And of course, particularly, maybe just to comment from the context point of view, regarding authorship, we have been experiencing actually a number of issues with some of our international trials. One is usually the consortium considered one or maximum two of the authors from local investigators. That's something discouraging actually participation of researchers in clinical trials in general in our context, because as long as they don't have that sort of recognition and career development, they don't want to actually spend time with clinical trials. That's one of the challenges. So in this regard, one of the addresses or solutions that we have been expressing is a kind of group authorship is one possibility. So like the team, the consortium will publish on behalf of the group so that all the group can be acknowledged and can be considered as co-authors. Collaborating authorship is also the other one. On the other hand, one of the disadvantage is because the local investigators or researchers have no protected time just for writing and leading. For that matter, they may not have the chance just to lead. So in that case, one of the solutions is just could be a manuscript write-up workshop could be one possibility that will help the local investigators to take part and lead manuscript writing, particularly in secondary papers, once the main paper from the
we seem to have lost Mekonnen, but I think the point has been delivered in terms of power dynamics that manifest in especially authorship. Again, this is an important metric in academia, and he mentions the, for example, approach of publishing as a consortium as opposed to individuals, and then he was talking about protected time. In Photomatta's presentation, she also mentioned the need to agree on these distribution of tasks ahead of time. And again, these are issues that we are dealing with in the Holicare Consortium, but I think they relate to many others. So we want to move on, and I come back to you, Mats, and I want to ask you about capacity building. We go into studies where you go to a country and a site, and they might not have the necessary infrastructure, and then we have to discuss what do we do? Do we have to build a lab? Do we have to build biobanking facilities, or do we take the samples away and forever leave this site to stay the way it is? So can you give a comment on this and how you've been addressing these issues, Max?
Thank you. Can I actually start by commenting on the previous speakers?
Please.
And the authorship, and also on Joop's comment on community benefit. I think both the authorship issue and how communities benefit from the research results is also connected to informed consent and incentives for participants. It's all about how do we view the overall benefits at different levels we get from this. Is research becoming transactional or not? Is there a difference between not providing incentives for local participants, saying that is a no-no because it should be informed, and then kind of saying that we should have, as a community, we should have a benefit, or as a co-author, you should have a benefit. Is there a difference there? And I think it has also to do with the power dynamics in this. Who is making the claims? Who is deciding when it's okay with the benefit and when it is not okay with the benefit? So I just wanted to bring that up as something to think about. When is one benefit not okay and one is expected, so to say. On this issue of capacity building, I think what you're describing here, John Black, in terms of more like, I don't know what it's called, like helicopter research or something, coming in, getting your data and running away, and leaving the community empty, or how to say it, without any benefit from it. It's
no
of
meaningful
course,
involvement.
yeah,
Yes.
meaningful involvement or anything. I mean, that is, I think we are beyond that. That is, of course, not acceptable at all. All research should be done in collaboration, and it should not only be done in collaboration in terms of us being partners in a project. It should also be done in collaboration in terms of formulating the research questions, the needs. Why are we doing this research? Where it is coming from? Who has been part of the creational process in setting this research project up? Because capacity building doesn't start with being educated as a data collector or an epidemiologist or analyzing data. Capacity building is also about owning the project, owning the research questions from the beginning, so to say. So I would advocate for more co-creation in these trials, in the research, and think about capacity building from an earlier stage, not only as now we have to go there and provide a lab, or we have to provide training or something like that. It should also be part of the foundational collaboration, so to say. Who is deciding what should be done?
Thank you, Matt. I come to you, Job, on, you could comment, of course, on the same issue, but I wanted to, in the interest of time, go to the question of the role of funding agencies. And let me set the context for this. It so commonly happens that there is a researcher who has a good track record and high chance of getting a grant, and they write, but they want to do it with collaboration because maybe the funding agency wants that. And so they just do sort of a token, researcher from Uganda, from Kenya, from somewhere, come and join us. So there's not really a lot of contribution from there. So the question here is, what can the funding agencies do to basically stop that from happening, so that we have this co-creation right from the inception of the project, as Matt has mentioned? When you're reviewing a proposal, I assume many of you review proposals, do you look for these issues and ask and demand to see that these things, that there's meaningful engagement and collaboration, and also the plans for when the study is over, that there remains something in place to benefit the community?
Right, thank you very much. Sorry for the interruption. The internet is stable from my end. Sorry for that. So maybe I can comment on overall. I'm not against consortium, because science is universal, so everyone can contribute to the same goal. But still, as we have been talking about, like making a balance, and all are contributing and benefiting the same or equal. It's important to ensure that all are actually engaging equally from the very beginning, from conceptualization to report writing. So as long as we have a mechanism to ensure all stakeholders, all actors are actually engaged on the same page throughout the process, I think that's not something we cannot actually object about. So the most important thing is just the platform and the mechanism should be able to ensure and prove that all are actually taking part equally and the benefits the same. Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I saw that Matt was nodding a lot when I was discussing this issue, so I think you have a lot of comments on it. So I would allow you also to comment. And again, if you are in the chat in the audience and you want to comment on this, you can type not only just the questions but also your contributions there. And the same applies for Fatoumata. But Matt, how can we ensure meaningful engagement from the funding agency's perspective?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's a tricky question because, the funding agency, I'm just about to embark on some review tasks here, looking at different proposals. And in writing, you can write anything. I mean, and we know how to tick the boxes and how to say the right things. So it's quite difficult for a funding agency to safeguard against that. You can bring in, as you mentioned, some local researchers. You can have goalkeepers in any institution that just sign that, yes, I'm on this paper or this proposal. So it's very difficult. I think that what could maybe be done is to look even more closely at the research idea and the relevance for when assessing proposals, and maybe less on the merits of the applicant. And then, of course, stress these issues of collaborations and equality and equity, etc., in other channels. But it's difficult in writing when everyone knows what to write, basically, in this study.
Yeah. Is there a way in terms of monitoring of the progress of the studies to go back and check if whatever people promised has been delivered from this perspective?
I don't think, yeah, I mean, so some funding agencies that are more involved might be able to do that, to have follow-ups, etc. That, of course, also poses the question about the freedom of research and the independence, if they are meddling too much. Also, as we know, if anyone been involved in an EU project, we know the excessive amount of reporting and follow-up that is basically draining energy from the actual research and research question. So maybe that is also not a way to go. I would advocate less for control and more for virtue, basically, and try to trust and build that aspect of this issue. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Difficult questions. And again, this is how ethical issues are. You never really have a very straight path to it, but we always strive to get there. I see that Yap is back and he wants to comment on that. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. It's indeed a very tricky question, especially in the new environment, the global health environment, where there has been some substantial cuts in the funding for global health, which also includes research. And as I mentioned, I'm leading the continental mpox response, where countries and agencies has pledged around $1.1 billion to support the mpox response. Now, part of it was going to research. And what we realized, we put in place a tool called finance tracking mechanism. And indeed, if you don't monitor, at some point, it might be very difficult for you to ensure that the member state, the agency that have pledged will actually give that money. I agree with my colleague that we should rely on most of the agency, but also sometimes they need that monitoring. They need to have those back and forth to ensure that they are aligned to their promises. Because if not, we have some studies that have stopped in the middle because the funds have not been made available. So we definitely need to have both the monitoring, but also the stimulation of the donors and the domestic funding, because we are talking a lot about the donors. But if research is critical for the countries, then they should also themselves invest into that. African country has agreed to give 15% of the GDP to global health, to health, including research. We are pushing them so that if they make it available, then we'll be relying less on the donors agency. Over to you.
Thank you so much. We are reaching the end of this panel discussion, but I wanted to just quickly get your snippet discussion on the issue of participant reimbursement. It was a question that we posed to the audience at the beginning, and I wanted to hear your different perspectives on that. Starting with, you've been speaking, so you can just continue on this issue, just briefly.
Yes, the issue of participant reimbursement is critical. We need to reimburse the transport. We need to reimburse the time they spend when they come to participate in those studies. However, we need to rely on those community advisory board or committee who will actually tell us what is reasonable, what will be the support, the reimbursement, as compared to coercion. I recall during the old day of Ebola, there was a trial that was giving around $100 in terms of reimbursement in Liberia at the time for people participating in clinical trial. And in a country at that point where the average salary was around $40 to $50, you can imagine that this is not seen as a reimbursement, but rather as coercion. So the researcher should not decide on their own, but together with the community advisory board to know what is acceptable, what is needed.
Thank you so much. Do you want to comment on this, Mats?
No, I totally agree with Jaap. I could even take it one step further. Of course, the research should not be incentivized in such a way that you sell yourself, so to say, for benefits. But I come back to the power dimension again. Most often the participants are the one furthest down in the hierarchy, and we as researcher, we also benefit quite substantially from doing the research, and that is seldom discussed. So, but I totally agree that it should cover the expenses at least in these situations. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's proceed. So we are at the end of this session of the panel discussion. Again, very interesting topics. And I said we've been seated for about an hour now since the webinar started. We want to allow you to stretch your legs and get a cup of coffee or water, and we will rest for about 5 minutes and then return with a presentation from Dr. Caroline Wamala, and she's going to be discussing, wrapping this up with more of a didactical discussion on these issues. So again, thank you so much for being engaged and for an interesting discussion from the panel. So I will allow you to move away, and then we'll return in about 5 minutes. So welcome back. I hope you managed to take a breather, to stretch your legs, take a bathroom break. And now we'll return to the last part of this webinar with Caroline Wamala-Lashon, who is an associate professor and the director of SPIDER, here where we're broadcasting from, at Stockholm University's Department of Computer Science, Computer and System Science. So Caroline does research on gender and technology, and we think she's the best person to conclude this webinar with her didactical presentation. So Caroline, if you're ready, please share your screen and weigh in the discussion that has taken place before.
Great. So thank you so much for the introduction, and it has been especially rewarding to listen to not only Josie's real-world experiences, but also the panelists who share some really insightful reflections. I thought I would title this as Fostering Equity in Global Health Research, where the concept of global health research really is a site where I will try and situate my discussion on gender ethics, and contextual consideration in international clinical trials. I come to this discussion as a social scientist. So unlike the previous discussants and presenters, I'm from the social sciences. I'm an associate professor with a scholarly focus on gender and technology. And perhaps for those who are unfamiliar with what type of science comes from gender and technology or what it looks like from that perspective, I'll just very briefly mention that. My work examines both how technologies are used in gendered ways and how technology itself shapes and reinforces gender as a social structure. However, my analysis doesn't just stop there. I'm particularly interested in the broader power dynamics that unfold through technological systems. These are dynamics that go beyond gender, so we are more than just our gender as individuals, which means that I work through a concept known as the intersectional aspect or lens that looks at, for example, what someone's age or socioeconomic status or even their geographical location and education. These are all discussions that have come up with the previous discussants, how these axes of identity can actually, create situations of inequalities. So it is from this standpoint that I approach the reflections that I will share with you today, especially in relation to the Holicare project. And I hope that we will have some, insightful discussions at the end of this, because ethics are not just a checklist, but are deeply contextual and relational practices that are shaped by lived experiences, as we have heard. So it's been really interesting to listen to the panelists, and especially some of the points that both Yap Mekonnen as well as Fatumatu mentioned in terms of some of these reflections on structural issues. So the question I want to ask is, how do we institutionalize the reflections that have been discussed here into some real structural change? And I looked up, some articles that perhaps discuss this topic. And in one rather, classic article from the year 2000 titled "Moving to Research Partnerships in Developing Countries," Costello and Zumla, they want to argue for replacing semi-colonial research models with more equitable partnerships that are led by local researchers to ensure more sustainable and impactful research in health and in developing countries. So their article particularly highlights that much of the health research that is conducted in developing countries is dominated by foreign entities. And these models can often lead to research that might misalign with local health priorities, and it might not always, or the outcomes might not always be sustainable. They also emphasize the importance of research that should be led by national academics and institutions to ensure relevance and the applicability of findings. The same authors argue for local leadership to ensure that there's ownership, the ownership of the process as well as the results are anchored in the context, to also ensure that the likelihood of research influencing national health policies is quite high. The principles that they outline in the article is the notion of mutual trust and shared decision-making, national ownership of research agendas, and an emphasis on translating research findings into policy and practice, as well as development of national research capacity. Some of these questions John Black has posed to the panelists, and Josie also highlighted them in her presentation in the beginning. Then we have another article from Seyi Abimbola, who is based in Australia and is a West African scholar based in Australia. And his article, the title is quite telling. It's "The Foreign Gaze, Authorship in Academic Global Health." Here he offers a critical examination of author dynamics. And this was a point that was discussed at length by some of the panelists, that we need to critically look at the author dynamics within global health research, particularly focusing on the implications of power imbalances between researchers from high-income countries and those from low and middle-income countries. He argues that authorship in global health research often reflects power asymmetries that privilege the foreign gaze over local perspectives. Thereby, these inequities that we've been talking about, for example, will have an impact on the knowledge that is produced. Abimbola's concept of the foreign gaze is used to describe how global health research is frequently conducted and authored by researchers from elsewhere. And sometimes this can mean that local voices or perspectives might be sidelined. The dynamics can lead to research that is less attuned to local contexts and needs and potentially reduce the relevance as well as the impact. Abimbola further argues that authorship patterns in global health research often mirror underlying power structures, where researchers in lower middle-income countries are disproportionately represented in lead authorship positions. And we all know what this means in terms of academic merits and metrics and so forth. It's really critical that recognition is, afforded or accorded accordingly in order to be able to support each other in this path. When research is primarily designed and interpreted through a foreign gaze, Abimbola continues, it may overlook or misrepresent local realities and lead to less effective or even inappropriate health interventions. Abimbola advocates for increased reflexivity amongst the researchers, encouraging them to critically assess their positions and the power dynamics that are at play through these collaborations. He suggests that journals and even institutions should adopt policies that promote equitable authorship practices, ensuring that researchers from partner countries receive appropriate recognition and leadership opportunities. Essentially, the argument is that addressing authorship inequities is not merely about fairness in credit allocation. It's about ensuring that global health research is inclusive, it's context sensitive, and ultimately more effective in addressing the health disparities that we have. I think somebody talked about the helicopter gaze. Abimbola refers to it, I think it was you, Mats, but Abimbola refers to it as the parachute research, where he's advocating for a move away from parachute research, where researchers from elsewhere will come and conduct studies without any meaningful local collaboration, as John Black also alluded to. Abimbola further says that we should have more collaborative approaches that engage local researchers throughout the process of clinical trials and global health research. He also actually, argues that funders or funding bodies should monitor. I think this is a question that was finally posed towards the end of the panel discussion, that funding bodies need to monitor and support partnerships that adhere to these equitable principles. So they should invest and encourage capacity building initiatives that will ensure the strengthening of local research infrastructures and capacities. If we try and look at the theoretical aspects of this whole discussion, what exactly are we talking about here? Power imbalances, as I'll try to show, are deeply embedded in how research itself is structured. The panelists have argued for the idea or the approach that from the beginning, all the way into the actual implementation to the end, there should be a co-design process. And this is what Miranda Fricker, from her 2007 as well as a 2017 edition of her chapter in, a Routledge handbook about epistemic injustice, and it's titled Power and Ethics of Knowing. She talks about, for example, epistemic injustice. And this concept will help us to understand why researchers from the global south might be invisible. I will also discuss a little bit about the concept of intersectionality. This is part of a tool that helps us to understand other identities at play in what opportunities or resources are available to researchers from the global south. So beyond gender, what about class? What about the geographical region in which they come from is contributing to marginalizing their visibility in these international clinical trials? These are questions that hopefully we can discuss. So when we talk about epistemic injustice, I've talked about Miranda Fricker, who mentions or brings this concept into discussion. But what is epistemology? Maybe some might ask. It's a branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, basically asks, how do we know what we know? In natural sciences or in science, for example, there are hypotheses, methods, and validations that are part of producing knowledge. What epistemology does is ask what counts as knowledge, who gets to be considered as a knower, and how is knowledge legitimized in society. So essentially, epistemology is a theory of knowledge, but instead of focusing on methods alone, it zooms in to ask whose knowledge is heard and whose knowledge is being ignored. So when Miranda Fricker talks about epistemic injustice, she essentially says that this is when someone's word is discredited or dismissed because of some sort of prejudice. And I have an example here, like, for example, you have a traditional birth attendant. Somebody asked a question about rural areas in collaboration with urban areas. So you have a traditional birth attendant in a rural area whose knowledge might be dismissed in favor of an educated nurse. So this is epistemic injustice, where that knowledge from the traditional birth attendant might not be as recognized or even valued to the same extent as her counterpart who comes from an urban area and is well educated. Miranda Fricker further argues for or talks about hermeneutic injustice, which occurs when an individual doesn't have the language or the conceptual tools to make sense of their own experiences because of dominant knowledge systems that don't include their perspective. For example, a woman who might experience health disparities might not have the academic tools to explain them as structurally unequal, because that lens is excluded from her language or even mainstream discussions. So essentially in global health research or international clinical trials, epistemic injustice is not abstract. African researchers or researchers from the global south need to go beyond being treated as data collectors to being recognized as knowledge producers, and their lived experiences should not be filtered through frameworks that are coming from elsewhere, because this will create injustices as argued for or by Miranda Fricker. And this context is further compounded from a gender perspective because women, especially from low and middle income countries, are often both underrepresented and unheard. I think Fatoumata mentioned this very briefly when she talked about the leadership aspects. So what's the takeaway from this particular slide? We've talked about epistemic injustice, and here we've tried to weave in the discussion of the global perspective, where the post-colonial critique is also very critical. If we're talking about science, and this is something that Yap and Mekonnen also mentioned, lab protocols require rigor and balance. But if we are to also apply the same type of rigor and balance to our knowledge ecosystems, we can really work towards ensuring this bridges that kind of exist right now when it comes to international clinical trials. We also need to go and validate knowledge from certain geographies or voices if we're to have a complete and credible outcome of the science itself that we're looking at. So epistemic diversity is not just political correctness, it's better science. Gender, as I've mentioned very briefly, and I think Fatoumata also mentioned that very first topic, that women are often underrepresented when it comes to leadership positions. Gender remains unexplored in global health collaborations. Women often don't hold leadership positions and often carry invisible administrative and even emotional labor. According to Morgan et al., in their article on gendered health systems, evidence frameworks and implications for research, policy, and practice, they argue that health systems are not gender neutral. They are deeply gendered structures that reflect and reproduce power inequalities. They argue that gender affects every level of the health system, from who provides care, and this is normally typically women who are in lower paid roles, who gets the care, and even how care is valued. And here research, unfortunately, as well as policy, often fail to disaggregate data by gender. They miss important trends, for example, how women health workers are more exposed to certain risks and so forth. So there's a call for more responsibility of engaging gender analysis tools in health systems research or clinical trials to make invisible gender dynamics visible. And this is an argument by Hawkins et al. From 2017, who also say that it's critical that we make sure we visibilize, for example, the unrecognized or undervalued labor that could be inadvertently leaning heavily on women. There's also a Lancet Gender Equity series from 2019 that I dug up in preparation for this seminar that presents some really critical insights. It argues that because women are the majority of the health workforce globally, they're underrepresented in leadership and policy making. And as a result of this, there are institutional biases that accompany this underrepresentation. There are pay gaps, they have limited mentorship, an issue that Fatoumata also mentioned, and these issues perpetuate the continued inequality that women face. This Lancet series argues for system level change, where we need gender transformative policies, gender responsive leadership metrics, and accountability tools. There's also an emphasis on intersectionality, that is how age, for example, social class, geography, and gender, for example, and I will labor on the issue of intersectionality shortly, how these need to also be accommodated in ensuring an equitable, collaborative ecosystem or environment. So from how systems are built, as argued by Morgan et al., to how safe they are for women, as also emphasized by Hawkins et al., to who leads and gets cited and recognized, as noted in the Lancet series, we see a persistent pattern. Gender is not a side issue, it is structural. Addressing it is not only ethical, it is essential to the rigor, equity, and sustainability of global health research. Now, as I keep mentioning this concept of intersectionality, and I also noted earlier that it's a concept that dates back to 1989 by a scholar from the US who, in her studies, was looking at, for example, survivors of violence. And in her research, she looked at the social aspects of what it is that leads to the violence and the experience of it. Here, she found that a woman who's a survivor of violence could be that it's because of her race or even her gender. And so she looked at the metaphor of this intersection where cars, are crossing from left, right, and so forth. And that if there's a collision at that intersection, it could be from either direction. It could be from gender, it could be from socioeconomic status, it could be from the geographic location, the age, or any other identities that could be at play in this situation. So what Kimberly Crenshaw, the scholar who came up with the notion of intersectionality, argued for was that gender doesn't operate alone. It interacts or intersects, as we see in this metaphor here, with other social structures such as age, religion, regional locations, and so forth. And the argument here is that we need to take into account different population groups and how they are located in multiple forms or multiple paths of exclusion. So age, gender, region, or location can have an influence on the opportunities, or for that matter, resources that a person has. We're all influenced by or impacted by multiple dimensions of diversity. So gender collaborates or interacts with other sectors or other axes of power. And what intersectionality does is give us the tools we need to be able to conceptually think through and work with the identities and how they intersect to produce understandings of the differences that we see in our lives. So even though we're talking primarily about exclusion, marginalization, intersectionality can similarly be used to understand, for example, experiences of privilege. And for us, at any one time, all of us might experience that privilege. At any one time, we can all experience that exclusion. So what could be the policy gaps and challenges in what we're talking about here? I think the general argument is that, yes, ethic reviews exist, but they rarely cover issues like authorship parity. And I think this is a point that has been labored on. They rarely cover issues of authorship parity or time compensation. We lack, for example, systemic policies that prioritize equitable power sharing from the grant application stage all the way down to how we disseminate the findings and the outcomes of international clinical trials or global research. Here we have Chu et al. From 2014, who have a paper titled Nothing About Us Without Us Towards Equitable Partnership in Global Health Research. And here they argue or critique that notion of tokenism and power asymmetries. And John Black talked about this tokenism in global health partnerships. Rather, they call for equitable collaboration models that value low middle-income country partners as intellectual contributors and not just as data gatherers. Partnerships are often extractive in global international health research exercises. They're often extractive, where data and samples are collected, while little recognition and funding stays in the context where this takes place. It's important that there are partnership principles that are built on mutual respect, co-design, shared ownership of data, as well as equitable authorship or patent registration that might come out of this. So we need structure changes when it comes to funding models. We need institutional incentives and authorship practices that will allocate that time. That was also mentioned, I think, by Yap or Mekonnen. Patel and others from 2015 also have a paper that talks about addressing power imbalances in global health and what are the imperatives for equity. They look at, for example, how equity cannot be achieved through ethics approval alone. Equity requires systemic change, where lead institutions, whether they're in the global north or from the global south, need to collaboratively change the research landscape and ensure inclusivity of low middle-income country priorities. The recommendation from this article is that there should be low middle-income country leadership in research design. I think this is a point that Matt's also labored on. There should be redistribution of decision-making authority and recognition of contextual expertise. And what equity requires is a confrontation and transformation of the systems that might be sustaining power hierarchies in research. I'm aware that time is flying by, so I'll try and wrap this up. Holicare offers a very promising model, and one that we are all really working to, not reproduce some of these research findings that I've shared with you here, and you've also heard from the colleagues that have presented before me. But some of the global code for conduct for research publications that have been coming out over the years, there's one from a project called Trust that was funded by Horizon 2020, the EU, that focused on practical ethics frameworks for conducting research ethically and equitably in low middle-income countries. And here they were arguing that it shouldn't just be a theory, it should be everyday practice. They live with 4 principles of fairness. Fairness in research priority settings, where low middle-income country voices should shape research agendas in collaboration. There should be fairness in representation where equal opportunities for authorship, leadership, as well as recognition are at the table when discussions and roles are being discussed. Fairness in knowledge sharing where we have open access to the data. There's also data return and translation of findings. These are all issues that we've discussed at length, as well as fairness in post-research benefits where local communities are not just, being mined for data, but can also be a part and benefit of the research outcomes. So we need enforceable, equitable mechanisms, mandatory co-leadership, as well as equity plans in grants, shared intellectual property rights, and intentional authorship protocols. Here we need funders as well as institutions to enable this shift structurally. Research equity needs to be institutionalized, not just encouraged, and we need equity indicators in grant evaluation as after the process, and funding should support co-leadership, not just subcontraction or subcontracting. There need to be institutional changes to reward inclusive practices, for example, co-authorship metrics, so that we recognize those colleagues who actually actively work to ensure this, collaborative spirit even in these research processes. So I have a list of publications that I'm happy to share at the end of this talk or slide. But if I try to wrap this up very quickly, if we're talking about epistemic justice, we talked about it as injustice before, but now we talk about epistemic justice. It's not about giving voice, it's about changing the terms of knowledge production. Here we need to design the future of research together, where equity isn't just about capacity building, but it is about social justice. Holicare's work is part of this revolution. It's really, heartwarming to see that strides that, for example, Josie and her team have gone to ensure, for example, linguistic inclusivity, age inclusivity, to ensure that even, anybody, regardless of age, is able to determine when or if they want to be a part of the trials. It's also encouraging to see that we are working to ensure that we redefine what research looks like in an international setting from Holicare. So this is something that I wanted to share with you, and I'm happy to take discussions and questions and comments if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for this comprehensive review of the literature. What I can conclude is that this is a topic that is of interest from different researchers. It affects different research studies. And so it's, I think, timely that we're also discussing it. My few takeaways are the idea of reflexivity, basically introspection from ourselves as the researchers. When we're discussing what the funding agencies should do, Matt said it is difficult, but now this is something that we can do ourselves as researchers. So I think that is an important concept to take away. The issue of having studies that put the local needs and priorities is important, so that we don't just do research that is relevant in the country where the funds are coming from, but that is really reflective of what is needed at the local community. So I think these are important. And I also think that researchers can help in ensuring that research is more equitable. For example, when you are contributing to research grants, when you are reviewing studies, when they have been submitted to, let's say, journals, and also when reviewing grants. So thank you again so much for this contribution. And I would like to thank you so much for having stayed with us for this webinar that has taken 2 hours. I hope it was very informative for you as it was for me.